Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. In her debut novel and latest children's book, Hiba Noor Khan tells the story of a sophisticated, selfless, and highly risky resistance movement that was carried out from the Grand Mosque of Paris during the Holocaust and the Second World War. Through the eyes of 11-year-old Safiyyah, we explore how the German forces were advancing into Paris and how everyday life was becoming increasingly disrupted, especially for the Jewish community. As things turn darker, Safiyyah ends up in the centre of a brave plan to save the lives of innocent people. I loved the book, and while it is middle grade, it's the perfect story for all ages, full of wonder and shedding light on an amazing piece of history that has been somewhat lost and forgotten. I'm so glad I'm speaking to Hiba today. Hiba Noor Khan is the author of 6 books for children, including Safiyyah's War, How to Spaghettify Your Dog, The Little War Cat, Inspiring Inventors, and One Home. The Little War Cat, published in 2020, was longlisted for the Jallock Prize and the UK LA Book Award, and her work has been translated into Swedish, Korean, Turkish, Breton, Chinese, and more. She secretly wants to be an explorer and is happiest surrounded by nature, especially near the ocean. Hello, Hiba. Welcome, and thank you for joining me on the Diverse Bookshelf today. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to see you and hear you, and yeah, I'm really excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on. Obviously, we are friends in real life, which is one of my greatest joys in life. But I'm really excited to talk about your work and for other people to learn a little bit more about you. So to begin with, I really want to get to know what led you to becoming the author and the writer that you are today. What's been your journey?
I suppose maybe a slightly unconventional one, considering I studied engineering and then went into physics and became a physics teacher. But I think it probably started many, many, many years ago. I always wanted to be, I remember wanting to be a baker, a farmer, an explorer, a pirate, a lot of things, and I could never really make my mind up. And I think 18 years or 16 years old, when you have to choose your GCSEs and stuff, is just way too young. It was very naive. And I always loved science as well as and the humanities, and I think I just had this broad interest in things and in life. And I think now having spent 4 or 5 years sort of mostly working on words and stories and books, now I kind of realize that this is almost perfect, because being a reader and a writer allows you to live 1,000 lives, literally just sat in a cupboard in the UK. You can be anyone and anything. So yeah, it was kind of a weird journey to it. The actual my journey to my first book, I think I'd always had this aspiration to write a novel, but it was always going to be an adult novel, and that's still there, sort of at the back of my mind and heart. But yeah, I was working in refugee advocacy at the time, and I'd worked as a freelance journalist for quite a while, and then I actually responded to an open call on Twitter from Penguin, who were doing the Extraordinary Lives series, and I literally just responded on an absolute whim. I was like, this is ridiculous. I've just got 5 minutes and I'll do it. And then got an email back and I was like, is this spam? And it wasn't. And it was, and then went through the selection process and stuff. And that was how I ended up writing my first book. And then I think that was a major catalyst, because even though I'd felt before, I do love words. I was a massive bookworm as a kid. I always had a book on me. I always had this weird obsession, I have to read something. So I remember literally I would sit at breakfast and read the back of a cereal box over and over again. I just had this weird compulsion. You're probably similar. But I read more interesting things now, thankfully, than cereal boxes. But yeah, I think I'd never really thought that it was a tangible, realistic career for me until that book was published and I saw it on a shelf in Waterstones. And then all of a sudden it was whoa, maybe I can do this. And then I took the plunge and started querying agents and started just allowing myself to explore what ideas I had inside myself. And yeah, you know, like, I'm so grateful to God that from there on it's been quite intense and like a really beautiful journey.
Yeah, wow. And I think you served, I think, so many reminders in what you said. One of the first things you said was that being a writer allows you to lead 1,000 different lives. And I think the same when you're a reader as well. Like, it just helps you
Absolutely.
explore so much and to unlock different parts of yourself and your personality.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons why I love reading so much.
Mm-hmm.
But also that you've had such an unconventional journey, and that it kind of reminds us that you don't have to follow a path, like a strict path or a certain path that you maybe thought you would when you were 15 years old. And so many authors that I've interviewed that are also, a lot of them older than you as well, that have come to writing a lot later and have felt like, but it's something that you can pick up at any time, which I really
Absolutely.
love as well. But
Mm-hmm.
what is it that drew you to children's literature? Because I know you said that you do want to write an adult novel, but most of your published books so far anyway have been for children. So what's led you to that?
Yeah, so I think I have always loved children's books, to be honest. So I would, like, I've got nephews and nieces, and they've sort of always been in the periphery. My mum also loves children's books, like, so she will literally just have a picture book on her coffee table as a coffee table book, because
Oh,
I think
that's so
he's an
nice.
artist, and I think she sort of maybe has always recognized the magic of them. So I suppose they've sort of always been around in the periphery. And then I remember a few years ago, like, distinct picking up. It was actually an Oliver Jeffers book with one of my niece's books, and reading it to her, and I read through it, and you know, she enjoyed the story and then was like, read it again, and I was literally sat there like sobbing because
Oh,
I was just so moved. But I mean, that's just like, it's a story of my life, but I was so moved by it, and I think it kind of got me reflecting on how 500 words, or, you know, books for children can literally be so potent and powerful, you know, despite not having the length or the seeming, you know, apparent depth that maybe adults books do. So I think that was probably a bit of like a pivotal moment of realization. But then, yeah, so I think, so obviously the first book that I wrote that was for the Puffin series was a children's book, and then I think it was probably like a tap opening in a sense, and something like a plug pulled, and it wasn't this conscious thing that, like, oh, I've written a children's book, so I'm going to carry on writing children's books and, you know, archive the adult ideas till later. I think it was just that it just started to flow from there, and I just followed what was coming. And as I said, it's been quite full on, so I've just not really had the time to sit down and focus on anything else. And I genuinely really enjoy it. I think I'd worked as a teacher as well, like a senior school teacher, and I think there was also this like sense, and I'd also, so having worked in like sort of at the peripheries of politics and in journalism as well, and I sort of took a step back from that area, realizing that children's minds and hearts are probably the most precious like reserve or resource that we have as a society, because they like their capacity for empathy, their capacity for real connection, their capacity for all these like beautiful things hasn't been hardened yet by, like, you know, the world around us and its sharp edges and politics and media and propaganda. And I think that, yeah, particularly when I was writing The Little War Cat, that was something that I was kind of acutely aware of, was that, and when I would go and do school events and, you know, like readings and speak to parents, it was that kind of cemented for me this sense that the child's mind and heart for us as a nation, as a society, as a community, as humanity is incredibly important. And children's literature, you know, with its ability to shape and inspire and illuminate, that the child's mind and heart, therefore, is also incredibly powerful and important. And I think that's definitely one area. And then when it's come to, so Safiyyah's War is my first middle grade novel, so it's my first of this genre. And with this, I think I realized how lovely a genre it is. Like, I feel like it's kind of, they're still sort of young enough to put in magic and wonder and enchantment, a way that sort of fizzles out maybe once you come to YA, but also old enough to be able to, you know, put in really sort of substantial and significant topics. So I feel like there is a really lovely like middle space, and yeah, I'd like to explore it more.
I loved everything that you just said, and I think I also love children's books for their like simplicity and how gentle they are. Like they just feel so calm and so soft, and sometimes just like tapping into the innocence of being a child, and just not even being a child, just being a person, like reminding us about the joy that comes from eating your favorite sandwich, or going to the park with your friends, or picking daisies, like those things that are so prevalent in children's books. Like I absolutely love that. And I really like this idea of being able to gently introduce children to some more complex themes and issues and emotions as well. And I think you do it so beautifully in Safiyyah's War, but also in The Little War Cat, which is different, which is a picture book. So it's for children that are probably younger. But I think The Little War Cat, what made that so magical was that it was through the eyes of a cat. And before I kind of go into the themes, you do have cats also in Safiyyah's War, and I know you have cats yourself. Why do you like cats so much, and why do you feature them in your books?
Like is probably an understatement. I'm like obsessed probably. It's a very young age, like, and even now, even though I have two beautiful cats of my own, I don't know if it's cheating on them or what, but when I'm out, like, and I'm driving, I will literally, like, if it's a quiet street and I see a cat, like, I'll stop the car and be like, come on, let me stroke you, because, yeah, I don't know, it's probably a bit weird. But I've just been obsessed with cats since I probably knew what they were. I think that I just find them, like, irresistibly cute, first of all, but I think I've also probably experienced how comforting and sort of, what's the word, like, yeah, comforting and healing they can be. I think that's probably something that applies to a lot of animals. I think animals are just magical, and I genuinely do love most animals. But yeah, cats in particular, I think, like, I've had moments where I've been really upset, and then my cat has, like, jumped up and started to sort of, like, purr, like, as in I've been visibly upset and she's jumped up and started to, like, basically give me a cuddle. And I remember being so stunned the first time, like, she knows, you know, she knows this, and of course they do, they have incredible sensitivity. And but yeah, I think it's just inevitable that cats will feature and animals will feature. And I think animals are also a really lovely way to connect to children. You know, generally children have this sort of, like, innate sensitivity and receptiveness to animals that maybe sometimes some adults lose. So yeah, throwing in animal rescues and, you know, cute cats and stuff, I think is always a good way to engage. But they're also amazing writing companions. Like, I was at an event for children the other day, and I was telling them how I find my cat, because it's an isolating career being a writer. You know, it's a lot of the time it's just you sat in your own space with your laptop or pen. So they're actually amazing companions. And I was saying that, like, some of the wisdoms that they've taught me, from amongst the wisdoms that they've taught me, is that all the time should be snack time, and that if I'm ever under a lot of pressure and I've got, like, a looming deadline of, like, 20,000 words, I've done none of it, like, now, a good solution is to just take a nap. So yeah, they teach me things too. But yeah, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but I guess I'm just a bit in love with their species.
Oh no, I love that. I also am very fond of cats, and I think you're right. Like, so many times when I've been out and I've seen somebody walking their dog, and, like, a pushchair goes by, and the child just automatically reaches out to stroke the dog, and I feel like that kind of, like, wariness and fear that can develop, it doesn't seem to be innate. It seems to be something that develops later on, maybe from a bad experience, but also, like, sometimes from stories that you hear or things that you see on TV. So yeah, I mean, I also love cats. But going back to what you said earlier when you were talking about the precious nature of children and their hearts, and I think there's such a like a desire or a yearning to also protect that childhood innocence, and we want to shelter children from the harsh realities of the world. But you've made a really conscious effort to make your books about some really serious things happening around the world and some really, difficult themes and issues. Obviously, The Little War Cat is about the war in Syria, and also then Safiyyah's War is about World War II and the reign of the Nazis, essentially. How do you go about taking such serious topics and translating them in a way that is like not only appropriate but gentle and also impactful for children?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, yeah, just like on your first point, that's definitely an instinct that like I identify with, in terms of just wanting to shelter and shield, because you're like, you've got this pure, beautiful, sweet, innocent little being that, has come from heaven, or whatever your belief is, that, and you look at the chaos in the world around us, and it's just like, how can these two things meet without sort of destruction and shattering? And I guess that's something that maybe a lot of us go through. At some point, we come into contact with the darkness and the harshness in it, and it is a really sort of devastating thing. I think with The Little War Cat, that was probably the first. Well, it was the first time that for children so young. I don't think before, so it was actually, in that instance, it was having worked as a refugee advocate and also been to the Syrian refugee camps. It was this combination made me really feel like I need to write this book, because before that I wouldn't have thought that a book about war is necessarily sort of, ideal for children this age. But it was this realization when I was working with refugees here. So I'd seen the refugees who had fled the war in Syria, and they're seeking safety and shelter and just somewhere to exist as a human. And then I was working with them refugees who had come here, and from all over the world, from Afghanistan, Congo, loads of different countries. And even though they'd found physical safety in the UK, so there weren't any bombs, there weren't any sort of threats of air raids or drone attacks or anything like that, I was constantly so heartbroken for them, because the psychological and the social security that you also need to be safe wasn't being found. And I think I sort of, because of this propaganda media attack, this agenda of scapegoating migrants and refugees and anybody who had become the other. And it was realizing at that point that primary school children, 5-6-year-olds, they're seeing the headlines, they see the newspapers when they walk past them in the supermarket, they overhear conversations, they will come across a refugee, there might be one in their class at school, they might have neighbours, and actually that a war is being waged. So we're often in the midst of a non-conventional war. It's a non-physical war, but nonetheless it's a war of minds, it's a war of hearts that's constantly being waged, and we're being bombarded, and that actually this is kind of resistance to that, and we need that resistance. Sorry, I'm not answering your question, but yeah, so and in the same way, so I think that was kind of realizing the necessity of books like this. In terms of how it's done, I think one sort of main focus that I think for me is really important is to maintain, and I feel like this is just something that I've learned and I'm learning through life, and I feel like it's just one of those like key, like almost like a river or a thread that runs through the book but also runs through each of our lives, is of hope, and the fact that hope is this glowing entity, this glowing thing, that whether you think of it like a bird or a river, but it's this glowing thing that is necessary for us to truly to be human and to continue sort of living in this chaotic and dark world. And I think that, so there are definitely sort of truths that run through. Safiyyah's War is obviously set almost 100 years ago, and there are so many elements in it, so many of these rivers that run through it that are just as relevant, and just as sort of universal then as they are today, because we're human, that human experience of life, whatever context it's in, is universal, and our need for hope is also universal, and like will be until, you know, the end of time. And it's something that's so innate and intrinsic. So I feel like when, you know, it's something, you know, it's the Holocaust or a Syrian war, or, you know, any kind of context of darkness, of tragedy, of horror, I think there's this fine balance of sort of introducing it and developing empathy in the child so that they're able to feel emotions but not break their hearts. So I think their hearts have to always be protected. You know, that there's no need to take it too far. It's a sort of feeling the emotions, but then always pulling it back to this glowing presence of hope, which will always be there. I believe will always be there. And yeah, and it's funny because, like, when I think about Safiyyah's War, I feel like, so I actually wrote it when I was going through a really dark time myself, and I had been, so I think I was due to start writing it like in the January or 1 month I was due to start writing it, and I'd gone through a really difficult time and I was really struggling myself, and I had to postpone it for a few months. And then I remember even when I sort of sat down, and I'd been sort of researching it, but when I sat down and tried to write, like it was very jarred, like not many words would come, and then all of a sudden they all started to come out, and I genuinely, it sounds really weird, but I genuinely feel like this book in some ways saved me. And like the characters, I mean, I think everyone who's written a novel will probably say this, that the characters are like, you know, they become like your family members, like they seep into your dreams, your waking consciousness, and they did a lot for me and still do sometimes. But yeah, I genuinely feel like the characters of this book taught me a lot. And hope is one of those key things. So yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question. Like 16 tangents.
No, that was honestly, that was so beautiful. Just listening to you reflect on that, and what you said about the universality of like hope and being a child and those kind of experiences. There's bits in Safiyyah's War, like if we omit the scenes that, you know, refer specifically to the Holocaust, that could be any time. It could be a story that's been told for today. It could be anywhere in the world. And that was one of the, I really felt that reading it, that you didn't have a sense that you were actually going back in time. And I think that that's actually really powerful, to be able to tell a story but to make it feel so not only recent but so relatable. I think that's incredibly powerful and really really demonstrates your talent. I think especially as you develop the character of Safiyyah throughout the book, and we see her relationship with her family, like with her father and her mother and her grandmother, but also with her friend Isabel. But there's also a really sweet detail where she's in the library and the librarian is giving her strawberry bonbons. And it's just such a clear description of how like the juice flows from the sweet. And since then I have been craving strawberry bonbons because it just really kind of, I think, helped remind us also about the real lives in a situation like that, and how everyday life continues and children still want to eat sweets, and they still love to have strawberry bonbons and oranges as well, which I absolutely loved. Did you ever feel like you needed to go back and change something to make it softer or make it a little bit more serious during your writing process?
In terms of softness or seriousness, no, I don't think so. I think we did have to go back and make changes, and one of the major changes was, and bless my editor for absolutely just being a hero on this, was cutting about 20,000 words, which is a lot, which is like a third of, yeah, it's a lot. But so in there were actually, I mean, there was like a whole character that was cut, that had to be cut through there, which kind of broke my heart a bit. But no, in terms of content, now I've not actually like reflected on that before, but no, I don't think there was much editing in terms of like this is too gritty, or this is too raw or too adult for them. I think I was I did have like this sort of low level of anxiety lingering until we got the early reviews in. So I think naturally, you know, and it's just been, obviously I had the reassurance of my editor and the editorial team, and once that came in, that was super helpful. But yeah, to be honest, thinking back now, when it was just me transferring this world from my own brain, and obviously my first time, it's my debut novel, you know, I was constantly back and forth within myself that, like, is this too traumatizing, you know, is this too painful, or is this, it was probably more leaning that side than is this too childish. Or, but yeah, I mean, you know, thinking about the bombing, thinking about things that are hinted at, even with, you know, when it comes to the refugees, when it comes to, because, you know, even things like killing and death, it's, you know, at the end of, I think, you know, they're all horrific, awful things for all of us at any age. And I guess as adults we're maybe just more desensitized, because you switch on the news and that's, you know, it's a given in our world. But obviously for children, yeah, so I did constantly have this conflict within myself, that is this okay? And I remember asking for, like, my mum for feedback and my husband for feedback, like, is this too much? But then, yeah, once it started to go through the editorial process, and then especially once the early peer author reviews came in, that sort of put my mind at ease. And I really love what you were saying, and your reflections. It's really lovely to hear it kind of put like that, because so as in some of the feedback that I've been having has included things like, it's an urgent story, or it's a story for our times. I think that was in Kieran Millward Hargrave's quote, was that, you know, it's a story for our times, just as much as, you know, if it reads like a classic or whatever. And I think that's something that really means a lot to me, and you just kind of explained it in words, in a way that was so lovely to hear, and I'm really grateful that it's turned out like that, because yeah, I think there's a lot in there. I mean, when I was writing, there was so much that I couldn't help but feel is so relevant to today. And, you know, the sort of, as you say, like this universality, and there are obviously truths in there that just relate to being human, that are ancient and unchanging, but also in terms of just topical current events, you know, where there's the irony in terms of, when I was researching the like this sort of smaller, apparent, you know, seemingly smaller resistances that were going on sort of on the streets of Paris, like the headwear rebellion. So there were women, because the Nazis were controlling, you know, they'd literally put on sort of like a dress code, particularly for women, and turbans were in fashion at the time, but you were only allowed certain colours, and they had to be a certain height. Otherwise you could be stopped and you know, penalised for that. And the women of Paris at the time were like, they were using their headwear as an act of sort of resistance or rebellion. It was, you know, they're living under this awful oppressive occupation, and you know, there was very little that the ordinary person, I say very little, but obviously the book is all about ordinary people doing sort of miraculous and sophisticated resistance efforts. But, you know, that's also, you know, it's also sort of probably few and far between, and quite drastic as well. But, you know, on a more sort of subtle and more everyday basis, the many women were resisting, and by, you know, wearing their turban a little bit higher than was allowed, or using different materials and colours, and you know, that was something that kind of, I suppose it gives strength, you know, when it becomes a little movement. It gives strength and solidarity, and you know, this sense of sort of morale, and you know, that's just one of many instances in the book where I couldn't help but think, while sitting there behind my laptop, you know, about the irony, and how that as a concept relates to now, and how this, you know, this sense of agency around a woman's body and a woman's outfit, and telling a woman what she can and can't wear, is just as relevant today as it was, you know, in World War II. And yeah, there's I think there's sort of bigger, heavier things that are interspersed through the book like that do keep it relevant. And I love, as you say, there's this sort of, I hadn't thought of it like that, but like a bonbon, or, you know, loving a fluffy cat, like these details that again are part of the human experience and a child's experience, that, yeah, I guess have made it relevant. So I'm really grateful that it happened like that.
Yeah, no, honestly, it was so great. And also, just as you're talking, I was thinking about what you said earlier about how it is important to introduce these things to children because they are going to be interacting with it, interacting with these issues, whether it's the refugee crisis or war in one way or another. And I think especially because we live in a world where like online content is so readily available and accessible, and the news kind of like bombards our everyday life from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to sleep. It's really hard for children to be sheltered from that anyway. But also because of the scale of the refugee crisis, there are so many refugees in our communities, but also like people from different parts of the world that have had forced migration experiences or other types of migration and still have had difficult experiences in settling down and accessing funds or employment opportunities, on facing racism. And this is the lived experience of all people now, I think, because everything is so intertwined. And just remembering, like, so I was at primary school in the 90s, kind of like mid to late 90s, and there was quite a large number of children that joined the school from Kosovo. And I didn't. I all I knew was that there were these children from Kosovo, and I had asked my mum, how comes, like, where did they suddenly come from? Because it wasn't just like one family. And obviously there was war in the Far East of Europe, but like I don't remember having anyone explain to me what that meant and what that was. And I kind of wish that there had been an introduction at that age, because it was only when I was slightly older that I understood what was going on. But because I was older, I was also, the information that was being given to me was far more graphic. And so I remember just being really horrified because it didn't have a gentle introduction to it. All I knew was that there was change, and you're a child. I was really happy that we had new neighbors and new people to make friends with, and that was really great. And I love the fact that they dressed differently and spoke a different language. Like, as a child, I was really fascinated by that because I was also different from so many of my peers. But I think the complexity and the nuance of what was actually going on, maybe there wasn't the right words or the right space at that time. But I really love this kind of like trying to bring it to children in a gentle way. I think it is definitely really important.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting hearing about your own personal experience of that as a child. And I think, yeah, it's just something that you're absolutely right in that times have changed. And I think that it's not sort of like a past tense thing, even. It's times are changing, you know, like now with AI and everything coming into play with kids. Like, it's sort of, I think it's unfathomable to any of us what, you know, the rate and intensity of media consumption and like bombardment and exposure, and then the chaos that ensues when a lot of it is fake and propaganda. And like, absolutely, just like, I remember, like, I grew up on Enid Blyton, and like I still look at trees and I'm like, where's the magic faraway tree, and what lands are at the top of that tree? And I think now we're just in such a different world that like, and I was just thinking when you were saying that, you know, you were exposed to these refugees and beautifully you made friends with them, and you know, like, honoured and celebrated the difference, and you actually felt a sense of sameness and shared experience as well. But the fact that you're exposed, like, I guess it just goes to show that being exposed to difference or a new group, just like, you know, Safiyyah and her classmates were in World War II in this story, as children are now, or in the 90s, and as they will continue to be, that many children may have this innate sort of instinct of warmth and compassion towards them. But at the same time as well, it's how much sort of fuller and how much more appropriate and how much more nurturing could the response to these people be if there was guidance? As you're saying, you know, there was no introduction, there was no one to kind of help you, you know, encourage you as to how to care for these people, because at the end of the day, they have so much more vulnerability, and so much more pain than the rest of us are privileged, you know, to not have. And yeah, again, so that's definitely a thread that's within Safiyyah's war that relates.
Yeah. And thank you also for sharing a little while ago as well as to how this book, or writing this book, like saved you through a really difficult time that was unrelated to what was happening in Safiyyah's war. But you know, that's really, really beautiful. And I think people can find healing through writing and through reading. And I think as well, that again is also really important for children, because writing and reading can provide like an escape, but also, you know, like an unleashing of creativity and a way to process so much of what's going on in their lives. So thank you so much for sharing that. But on healing and kind of like well-being, mental well-being, you're dealing with really serious themes in your books, well, in The Little Walker and Safiyyah's War. And I know that some of your writing has been informed also by your own work in sustainable development. I know that you've done work with Syrian refugees in Turkey, refugees in the UK, and also in Tanzania. So how do you kind of process and deal with all that pain? Because I too, as you know, have done a lot of work in sustainable development, and I have traveled to like Bangladesh and to Kenya and to Pakistan. And I think when you're confronted with the everyday struggles that people have, even if they're not fleeing war, if they're living in poverty and they don't have access to hospitals and food and water, dealing with it like up front, right in front of you, speaking to these people, it, for me, I have always felt myself flooded with emotions that I never knew. Like it felt like a different level of like sadness or concern and even worry as well. And that's really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So you not only like are you writing about these difficult themes, but I know you've also worked in that kind of sector and in that space. Yeah, so how do you deal with that?
That's a big question. Yeah, absolutely. I think for anybody being exposed to these contexts and these broken hearts and broken homes and broken, you know, nations is, or just struggling, you know, even if it's not war, as you say, whether it's in Tanzania, it was climate change refugees. It was, you know, just lands drying up. And I guess I think the like what you're getting at is the underlying thing across all of these different contexts is pain and struggle, and being exposed to other humans just like ourselves in very difficult situations and what it does to us. And I think that, yeah, absolutely, when you're a certain personality type and like you feel things deeply and intensely and you're empathetic, it's like it can destroy you. It absolutely can destroy you, because I know I've been through periods like, you know, I remember coming back from the refugee camps and like just not having it in me to talk for days, because you know where you can, yeah, the sense of despair can kind of encroach. I think for me, I think that's something that will probably long term be a struggle, and part of me is almost grateful for that, because I think that to become desensitized to it to a point where you can just sort of step away and be aloof in a sense and not be affected wouldn't be good. And that's not being true to myself or ourselves either, if you've been given, you know, intense feelings and the capacity to empathize with people. But I think, again, it kind of comes down to what I mentioned before about the focus being on hope, or the focus being on the sparks of light that are always present in the darkness. And I think, I mean, without getting too like existential and, you know, too deep, there's, again, something that I do deeply believe, and I know I'm sure you do too. I know you do too, about just the nature of human existence, is that there is always light. There is always light in the darkness, and that there is always hope, no matter how hopeless a situation seems. And I think I remember hearing something about that I don't remember where I heard it. I remember hearing somebody say that you just, in any situation, like, you just have to look, if you look closely enough, even if it's chaos and destruction and darkness, and it seems like the most, horrific, like, just despairing situation, that there will always be helpers. Like, even if it seems like everybody's tearing things to pieces, there will always be, and you might have to literally hone in and zoom in and wait a while until you notice, but there will always be that person or those people who are there. And that's something that, no matter where we look, like from the world wars to ancient times to contemporary situations, like, I feel like, that's just a reality. It's something that's an inevitability, and that to focus and hone in on that, the light, those people, those helpers, and that was sort of the spirit with the little walkout. Obviously, it's inspired by the Catman of Aleppo, who was one of those incredible inspirational souls who decided to choose the light and to choose hope and goodness. And in the same way, and in exactly the same way, really, Safiyyah's War, is telling the story of the those in the Grand Mosque of Paris who chose the light and who decided to resist. And I think for us, like, sort of being exposed to those things, I think my hope is that, even, like, as futile as it might seem, because I remember, like, it was with the media and the propaganda war and everything, and against refugees, like, into our times, that, there were points where, I think just before The Little Walkout was published, like the week before it was published, there was a boat that capsized, and there were a lot of deaths in the Mediterranean. And I remember just being so upset and heartbroken again, and almost feeling for a moment like, what's the point of writing a picture book for kids? Or, what is it really doing anything? Is it really going to change anything? Is it, what impact can this really have? And then I was reminded by loved ones that, no, like, actually, we can't underestimate seemingly small efforts. And I guess my hope is that with children's books, that it's something that's, the change that can come from it is something that's long term, and it's slow, and it's quiet, and it's subtle, because it's working on, sort of, I hope, illuminating hearts of the next generation, and that there's, there needs to be sort of patience and just, like, certainty in that. So I suppose, that's something that I hope, is that the books, and it applies to anything, whether, work that's being done in the charity sector, absolutely any effort that's being done in this way, that they're seeds, and that just in planting a seed, there's so much botany and seeds in Safiyyah's War as well, because I just love it. But that in the very act of planting a seed, patience is essential, and hope is essential, and certainty is essential, and that seed, even though it's tiny and it's unremarkable in its appearance, and it can easily just be cast aside and discarded, actually holds the promise of brilliant, beautiful life. So I think we just have to kind of hold on to that hope. And I mean, it's like the Islamic tradition about, how we're, like, commanded by God to, that even if it's the end of time and it's the end of the world, and it's the end of the world, and you hold a sapling, you should plant it, because it's just this sort of spirit, this beating heart that underlies our human experience. And I think turning towards these helpers, these lights, these sparks that are always there, and turning towards hope is almost like a rope in dark times, and if you can kind of hold on to that rope, it will pull you through.
No, absolutely. And I think, because one of the, I don't know if it's like a problem or like an increasing thing I'm, like, feeling or noticing, is that although we are in a place where we are bombarded with, like, news and information and bad news, it's also easy to turn away from it. it's very easy to change the channel on the TV. It's very easy to just scroll past something and not really engage with it. I really hope that we don't keep turning away from it, because there's so much that we need to know is happening, and so many people that need our help, but also like to be able to connect with like human stories and to understand that, you know, there's actual people who are suffering, and it's not just statistics or land or anything like that. And I guess the way to do that is hope. Like similarly to you, I worked in Kenya for 2 weeks. I went and put together some stuff for a maternal health project, and I came back and I felt like I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't really talk to people. It took me a long time to kind of like come out of that sense of despair, but I was also really conscious that there were things that we can do to help. And I guess sometimes the problem is when the issue feels so big, and you think, well, what is like a small donation going to do? What is signing a petition going to do? But the reality is, like, you don't know how big of an impact you can have. And how something as small as like a £5 donation, for example, or signing a petition or writing a letter to somebody, like what a big difference that can have. And it's important, I think, to hold on to that.
Absolutely.
I would like now to talk specifically about Safiyyah's War, because we've talked about lots of really interesting stuff, but Safiyyah's War is out in July. Introduce your book. Tell us a little bit about it. What's Safiyyah's War all about?
Safiyyah's War is indeed out on the 6th of July, and it's inspired by the true story of the miraculous, sophisticated, and largely forgotten resistance efforts run from the Grand Paris Mosque against the Nazis during World War II. So I guess it's a singing of unsung heroes, and it's kind of like a light that's being shone on a moment from history that is so profound and incredible that when I like take a step back and think about it again, it still takes my breath away. Like, I remember when I was sort of researching and first coming across the story of the mosque and of Ben Ghabrit, who was the rector at the time, so he headed up all of the resistance, and he's actually one of the main, like a key character in the book. I just sat at my laptop and I just cried and cried because I was so overwhelmed and inspired and awed by what happened. But also there was this other element of like sadness and urgency, in the sense that these stories haven't been told. Nowhere near enough. Like, I mean, I'd studied World War II at school multiple times. I've read novels, I've watched films, and I genuinely thought that I kind of had like a thorough overview of, you know, the key sort of areas of resistance, and yeah, I had no idea, and I was just really, really mind blown. So it's the story. It's told through the story of 11-year-old Safiyyah, who is a map-obsessed, animal-loving, very, very curious, and at times a bit feisty girl who lives in one of the mosque apartments. And her father is her father works with Ben Ghabrit, basically. So he's involved in the resistance, and she ends up inadvertently being sucked right into the beating heart of the mosque's resistance activities, and playing a role that she could never have imagined in saving the lives of Jews. Because of course, I mean, the estimates, the records are very, very sort of few and far between, because obviously at the time they were doing this resistance work and then trying to destroy all evidence of it so that, you know, it couldn't fall into the wrong hands. But it's estimated that potentially close to 2,000 Jews from Paris and further afield could have been saved through these efforts, and they're just so incredible. Like, I mean, it's that. So one element of it is that they Ben Ghabrit was forging fake identity documents and handing them out to Jews to pretend that they were Muslims so that they wouldn't be persecuted and arrested and killed. They also brought Jews into the mosques. So they would hide them. They would hide children amongst the children of the families who lived in the mosques, because they were sort of more conspicuous there in the apartments. And they would hide the adults in the hammam and the women's area of the mosque. And he had this, so Ben Ghabrit had this sort of bell system installed. So from under his desk, he had a bell. And if he rang the bell, an alert would be sent out into all the mosque sort of areas, and the Jews would then know to go. And they would buy themselves time. So whenever the Nazis were going to search the mosque, because they were very, very suspicious, and he was actually arrested multiple times as well. But so whenever they were going to search, he would ring the bell, and then they would buy time by saying to the Nazi soldiers, you can't come into the mosque with shoes on, because it's a sacred space and you have to take off the boots. And obviously they had these huge military boots that had to be unlaced, and they, through these operations, thousands of lives of Jews were saved. And they would then smuggle them, so they would take them undercover through the souterrain, so the network of underground tunnels that runs all the way beneath Paris, to the river, and they would hide them in wine barrels where they could then be taken to safety. So it was this incredibly sophisticated and, ingenious way of saving lives. And Ben Ghabrit is, one of my absolute heroes. And I went to Paris last year and visited his resting place and the mosque. And it's just, I've really sort of poured my heart into this book.
It is such a wonderful book, like such an incredible story. Like I can't wait for children to get that to get their hands on it. And I also feel like, I read it and didn't even realize I was reading a book aimed at someone that was like 25 years younger than me. Like it felt such a pleasure to read it, but also just so fascinating, because like you, I also feel like, well, I do know about the resistance movement and had no idea this massive operation was being run undercover from the Grand Mosque of Paris. And obviously, like, you go into a lot of detail about it. What was your research process like? Like, did you have access to a lot of sources? Because I know you said that so much obviously was being hidden because they didn't want to get caught. Because I do know obviously that there was a resistance movement, but so much of it felt like people were being hid, in spare rooms and attics and whatnot, and then, or they were given fake identities. But this was a huge system that had so many different elements to it, that thought about so many different groups in the Jewish community as well. So I'm just really intrigued as to how long your research process took. When did you get to the stage that you felt like you had enough information to write the book, and what it entailed?
As you say, there isn't a huge amount in terms of the actual things that were going on. It's quite limited. So there I was incredibly grateful for, and I've mentioned this in the acknowledgements at the back of the book. So there's Ismail Farouqi's excellent film, which is available as Free Men. There's some scholarly work, and there's also a brilliant picture book that was published, I think, a few years ago by Ruel and Dessay. And then it was sort of piecing together bits and pieces from like online journals. I travelled to the mosque as well, and I spoke to staff there who were really helpful and sort of showed me where the apartments would have been, and I was allowed to kind of wander around, because as you know, a lot of the majority of the book is set sort of in and around the mosque itself, which is a huge complex. So that was really helpful in terms of just figuring out spatially how the story will take place, and obviously, understanding where the apartments were in relation to the entrances to the underground tunnels, or where her father's office would have been, and just these small details that kind of, come together to make it real. So it was sort of piecing bits and pieces together. And even then, I think it was along the way, I think I definitely noticed this sense of, when it's come to the limited media coverage of this resistance, and Ben Ghabrit, I did notice this sense of minimizing in a way. So I noticed, like, at the beginning, I was almost, from everything I'd read, I'd felt like, okay, is the likelihood, or what was being pointed to was that it was Arab Jews who were being saved, or North African Jews who were being saved, and that kind of never really made a huge amount of sense to me. So obviously, in terms of like practicality and, you know, being able to hide people or hide children in the most conspicuous and safe way possible, of course, you know, if somebody ethnically looks like the congregation of the mosque, that's easy. That's a lot easier. But it just, I remember reading bits and pieces, and it just never really sort of, I think the spirit in what of a lot of what I was reading was that, oh yeah, you know, Ben Ghabri, you know, they saved Jews, but, you know, that's because they were their sort of ethnic peers, or, you know, it was their sort of the same nationality as them. And it never sat right with me, you know, just in my heart. I was kind of just like, I just don't understand. I was just like, that's just not right. You don't, you know, he's somebody who was risking his life on a day-to-day basis. He was arrested. He could have been killed at any moment if he was found out. And he did this for years for the sake of humanity. Why, you know, how can you discriminate then at that point? And then I read an article about how when there was an exhibition held in the States about the resistance work, that a man actually came with a forged identity document that had been stamped by the Grand Mosque of Paris, and asked the people who were doing the exhibition, why is this the kind of the narrative that it's the North African Jews that were being saved? And he said that this is my mother's forged identity document that saved her life, and we're not North African. You know, he was from a European background, Ashkenazi Jews. And I think that kind of just confirmed to me that, you know, there was no discrimination. It was, you know, anyone would have been saved. And actually, it wasn't even just Jews who were being saved. So they actually sheltered Allied soldiers who'd been injured in the war, and, you know, that was with the help of Dr. Ahmed Somia. So there's quite a few other true to life figures who feature in the story as well, and one of them is this doctor who used to he would pretend in his capacity as a doctor. So when Jewish children would come to his clinic, he would just make up that they had some sort of an illness and they needed to be sent out of the city for treatment elsewhere, just to get them to safety. And so, yeah, as you say, incredibly sophisticated and, you know, well thought out. And so it was sort of like, yeah, uncovering bits and pieces. And then I think it was after a couple of months, I think I felt like I had enough to come up with the sort of the skeleton of the story, you know, enough sort of solidity in terms of what happened. And then after that, I sort of trawled through like newspaper archives and clippings from those dates and found little details. And looking at photos was actually, I think, a really important part of my process when it came to feeling the story and stepping into the story and understanding how it was going to come about. Because obviously, yeah, video footage is very limited, but seeing photos inspired, yeah, there are actually two characters that are inspired by photographs that I saw. And I think somehow, you know, where like just seeing somebody's face, seeing somebody's facial expression touched me and moved me somehow, and then led to this whole rabbit hole of a person evolving out of that. But yeah, so I think a lot of the sort of smaller details came from small details in, so like, you know, reading, for example, I remember seeing a newspaper clipping about how on the day that Paris was bombed, there were pigeons, huge flocks of pigeons that were flying above the city, you know, really sort of frenzied. And that was something that I just scrolled down in my notebook, and that features in that scene. Bits and pieces like, I remember reading that when the refugees were coming into the city from the north, there would be siblings that would have ribbons tied around their wrists, and that was presumably so that they didn't get lost. And I think I tried to sort of step into the eyes of a child in terms of, you know, like small things that you might notice that are maybe mundane or, you know, seemingly insignificant details and then just using them to build up something that paints a richer image. Again, I didn't answer your question at all, but I don't remember what it was.
No, I mean, that's really fascinating, and what you said about the minimization of the resistance that you kind of came across in your research feels like I feel so uncomfortable hearing about it. Like, it feels quite sinister, and it almost also feels like, well, if that was the case, well, so what? It doesn't change the fact that they helped 2,000 people that would have otherwise been killed, right? But the fact that it's kind of being turned to be this, well, they already help people that, you know, are from the same part of the world as they are, they felt this kind of like kinship or brotherhood with, is really, really dark and doesn't seem nice at all. So I'm glad that you also came across something that kind of like countered that, and I hope that the narrative does shift more on that. And obviously, like, your book will go some way in doing that for sure, but also just bringing attention to the fact that it even happened, because it is, I think it's fair to say, largely unknown and hidden. So that's really, 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 really good, hopefully. And what has been your favourite part of writing Safiyyah's War?
So, favourite part of writing, I think... So my definite highlight of the research process, and I had actually started to write at that point, albeit scribbles, was visiting Paris. That was really, really lovely. That kind of, I spent a couple of days just cycling around the neighbourhood and the city, and really just like imagining Safiyyah running through these streets and these courtyards, and that was really, really precious, and I think really, really important to bringing it to life. So I absolutely loved that, and I was joined by my editor there as well for a morning, which was just amazing. And there's a scene in the book.
Did you have the character of Safiyyah in mind before you went to Paris?
I had a girl in mind before I went to Paris. Yeah, I had a young girl in mind, but I think it was very helpful in shaping her, because it's like, I think somehow being there and seeing the neighborhood and seeing like the layout of the streets and the layout of the mosque and just being there, being in situ, somehow because I'm quite a visual writer, so like I'll see scenes like played out in my head and then like re-see it a few times and then sit and write it down, and somehow being there just kind of like let her come to life for me a bit. So she was almost like let loose in her natural, you know, in her home, in her habitat, and I was kind of like somehow able to witness that in a sense. So, and like, wow, sitting in the mosque, I spent a lot of time in the mosque, so like I prayed a lot of my prayers in congregation in the mosque, and the cafe's beautiful, and just, you know, chilling in the gardens and stuff. And I was there one night, and I saw the moon rise past beside the minaret, and that actually inspired one of my favourite scenes in the book, which is where she's on the roof with her grandma. And so that was definitely a highlight. I think I remember a really intense part of writing the book was writing the ending, because I'd actually had the final scene, like the build up, you know, the sort of the ending of the story. I'd actually had that in my head, and all fully formed, like to minute details before I even started writing the story. And it was so weird, because I had this kind of like loose, you know, okay, I want to tell the story of the resistance through the eyes of a child who lives in the mosque, but that wasn't, I didn't have much more than that, until, and I woke up in the middle of the night and I could just like see it played in my head, and it was so crisp and clear, like a film. And it sounds so weird saying it now, but like I could just genuinely see it happening. And I remember like my heart was like pounding, and I was like, oh my god, okay, I know how the book ends now. And I could hear the sounds that would be going on, accompanying it. And yeah, it was like I'd lived that scene. So I think there was so much, like I then waited for a long time, for months, before actually getting to put pen to paper and writing that out. But I remember when I did, I was literally at the end of my chair and like biting my nails, and like, because it's a very tense scene, and that felt, I think it was almost like closure, or it was like, it felt very satisfying to put down this very powerful sort of experience that I'd had onto the page.
Wow, that sounds really amazing. Like, just, I don't know, I like the book is full of magic and wonder, and it kind of feels like your process has also been full of that kind of like light bulb moments and wonder as well, which is so lovely. Now, my final question, because we have been talking for a long time and I'm very conscious of the time. My final question is, obviously Safiyyah's War is coming out into the world. What are your hopes for the book?
So I think my hopes are for it to be a humanizing force in our world that's very, very divided, and I think that's on many, many levels. So I mean, obvious ones are, I think most people in the world who hear about Muslims and Jews like in the same sentence probably end up with images in their mind of conflict or tension, or, you know, not necessarily harmonious brotherhood and friendship and love. And I think that's, you know, that's sort of one of the obvious elements that, you know, this book will hopefully shine a light on, is that sense of reading between the lines, and, you know, not going with propaganda, and developing some sort of critical thought in terms of beyond the press and beyond politicians, and, you know, real things that have happened. And it's just, you know, one of many, many instances in which there has been perfect harmony. And obviously this is so much more than perfect harmony. It's, you know, it's the deepest sense of, the deepest expression of love, the deepest expression of honor and of value and of care for another human being. So I think there's this element of humanity. I feel like Ben Ghabrit and the characters who were involved in the resistance showed me something very, very powerful about what it means to be human, and that sort of reverence for that, the spark, or the, you know, the sacred that's within all of us, and how what we dress ourselves up with in terms of labels and names and, you know, all these superficialities or elements of identity that we use to kind of, you know, that act like walls between us and are then inflamed and, you know, dramatized by, the press and politicians, that actually, you know, what really exists when you strip it all down, and it is that key sort of human element. And then I think there are definitely other very key elements that I think are powerful and helpful for readers young and old to take away. And I, as I, you know, touched upon earlier, that I feel like these characters taught me a lot. And in one definite thread is that of being patient with yourself, being patient with your own heart and the hearts of others. And that kind of, through the character Monsieur Cassan, who's one of my absolute favourites, the old retired Jewish botanist. I think that's something that his character ended up teaching me in terms of grief and loss is obviously something that does feature throughout the book, inevitably being a story of this period and of this topic. And that, as you know, we've talked about, that's a human experience, and it's something that will touch all of us at some point in our lives. And just sort of the small and the subtle happenings, the small and the subtle everyday moments when it comes to living through grief and loss, that some of the characters kind of embody, and that element of being patient and being kind to yourself, because we are fragile, wondrous beings, is definitely one element. And as you said as well, there's this sort of the mental health element throughout, where Safiyyah, where she develops anxiety after a traumatizing experience, and she's scared to leave. I think that this element of nurture, of care, of patience, and honoring the self and those around you is definitely another thread. And I think just obviously there's the fact that I hope that, you know, it's enlightening in terms of just shining a light on this incredible moment from history, and I hope that it's something that's inspiring and you know, reminds readers that hope is always there, and that it lives on in seemingly unlikely ways sometimes. And again, I think that was Safiyyah's grandmother who kind of showed me that. But I think those are some sort of key takeaways that I would love for readers to experience.
Yeah. Oh, that honestly, that was so beautiful. And actually, I really appreciated what you said about the Muslim and Jewish relationships and kind of what the media will have you believing about how we're at odds with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really sad because there's so much like beauty in brotherhood and coming together. The kind of like the political situations that kind of have put these two faith groups at odds in many ways are so complex and difficult and messy, but also actually quite different and removed from the faith group itself, the faith groups themselves. And it's really difficult, you know, it's actually the situations that we read about are actually not about Muslims and Jews.
No, not at all.
They're about different, exactly, they're about politics and ideology and exactly. So yeah, that was really, really great to hear from you, and thank you so much for your time today. It has been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. I can't wait for more people to get their hands on Safiyyah's War.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much to Hiba for her time today. It was an absolute honour and such a pleasure to speak to her. I loved every second of this conversation and hope that you who are listening also did. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow The Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the podcast.